After news broke over the weekend that former President Joe Biden was diagnosed with prostate cancer, we're getting advice from local doctors about when you should go get checked. Prostate cancer is the second most common cancer among men, and by age 70, half of men will have some evidence of it, with one of the biggest risk factors being a family history. There are no symptoms that generally come before getting a diagnosis, and by the time someone starts to experience any sort of pain, the cancer is most likely pretty far developed. Urologist Benjamin Marsh with Essentia Health tells us the #1 way they test for prostate cancer is through a blood test, which is something they suggest men get as they get older.
Our guidelines recommend that most guys get a PSA level checked by age 50 to 55 is usually a good range to start checking. If there's a family history, starting as early as 40 is also not a bad idea.
Marsh also suggests talking with your local health care provider about what's the best time for you personally to go get checked out.